Oh, geez, it's recording already. Saleha is a clinical social worker with experience as a therapist, case manager, and a school social worker. Over the past 14 years, she has played various roles in many schools, including as an outreach worker for precariously housed youth, a school-based therapist, and a school social worker. She is familiar with education topics such as special education, 504 plans, ELL services, the many helping roles within schools, the legal rights of students and family systems systems of collaboration between schools and outside providers, and the differences between traditional public schools, charter and private schools. And she currently serves as the Social Emotional Learning SEL coordinator for Great River Montessori, which is a 1 to 12th grade, a 1st to 12th grade public charter in St. Paul, and is in the process of opening her own private practice. Saleha is passionate about healing-centered practices and policies, and specializes in working with immigrant families and LGBTQ+ children and youth. Her work is informed by client-centered attachment and trauma theories, and grounded in an understanding of intersectional identity and commitment to healing justice. As a former CLUS therapist, she is excited to have recently reconnected with El Consorcio and so many beloved colleagues. And today she will be presenting on decoding the complex systems and services in schools for mental health providers. So I will go ahead and share her PowerPoint presentation with you all. And you will also see her on screen. Technical difficulties. Slideshow. Oh, awesome.
Yeah, great. I just have 2 computers.
Okay, sounds good.
Hola, buenos días. Thank you for joining us here today. I am here in person at Great River School. Currently, there's nobody here in person besides Nancy and me and our social work intern Liv, but maybe more folks will come in. So if I get distracted and excited to see people, that's what's happening. But I'm very happy to see all of you online and some familiar faces. And I'm excited to be here presenting to you today. I would really love it if you would turn on your screens so I can see your faces, and hopefully have a little bit of participation from all of you, because there's a lot of things that we could talk about in terms of school systems, and it's helpful for me to hear what you all think is most important to learn about. So I'll say my name again. I'm Saleha Erdmann. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I'm a LICSW. I don't know why I made such a long title for this training. Sorry. But I will point out that I really love picture books and using them in schools in particular as part of my SEL curriculum. And if you don't know this picture, or this picture book that's featured here, it's a great book called Me and My Fear. Hang on a second. Oh, it's blurred, but you can kind of see it. Oh, if I hold it close to my face, you can see it. And I highly recommend all therapists who work with immigrant children get a copy of this, or any kid who struggles with anxiety or PTSD. So putting in a plug for this book. Okay. So this is a picture of Great River. So Liv, our social work intern, is here. Eventually, our reading interventionist, Gloria Narrowbrook, might jump in, and she also is a super experienced English language teacher, and so we might be able to ask her some more specific questions about EL services if that feels meaningful to you. So I wanted to tell a funny story. If you look at Jordan Jones logged in here for this training, you might recognize this younger picture of me and her in our 20s. And as Nancy said, I used to be a therapist at CLUS, and I was part of El Consorcio back then at the very beginning. It was called something else, like the Hennepin County Spanish-speaking mental health provider group or something. It was a very long acronym that no one could pronounce. And then later when it switched to El Consorcio, I wasn't primarily working with Spanish speakers anymore, so I didn't like stay a part of it. But last spring, in a like flurry of dropping my youngest off at preschool, and I was like trying to do all these errands, and I was in the car on the way to work, I was getting this really emotionally intense text from my coworker, Jordan Simajima, who is not Jordan Jones, about a meeting he was in, and something like really upsetting was being discussed. And I felt like I needed to respond, but I was driving. So I voice to texted, Siri, text Jordan, I really need you to speak up in that meeting. I think it's important that people hear what you have to say. And then I got a response that said, did you mean to send this to me? And I was like, come on, Jordan, of course I meant to send it to you. You should speak up. And then I realized that I had accidentally sent it to Jordan Jones, not Jordan Simajima, who I texted later when I was at a red light. And then Jordan said, you know, we had some back and forth, and she said, you should really join El Consorcio again. I was like, yes, I should. So I did that. And then I texted her that I had joined, and she said, and now you should come do a training on school systems for El Consorcio. So here I am, several months later, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Jordan. So let's get started. Yes. Oh, yeah, great. Oh, like Whitney's here. I got it. Nancy's reminding me I should let people in as if I see them popping up, so I'll try to remember to do that. Did Whitney get in?
I think so. Maybe
Well, she must have. Oh, I wonder. Well, I think we can figure it out. You're very welcome to lurk over my shoulder here. Yeah, sorry about that. Hi, Whitney.
Sorry, everyone. Try to make myself a co-host so that I can let other people in while Saleha is...
Oh, you know what? I don't know if I can do the PowerPoint if you do that.
Okay. Sorry about that.
We can.
I wonder if we could.
We can be creative.
Share screen again.
Oh, you have to make me the host again. While we're figuring out some technical stuff, I would be curious to hear, or you could put in the chat, what roles you all play, or maybe you could even change your login name. Like, I'm curious, are you a therapist? Are you an in-home therapist? Are you a school-based therapist? Are you a skills worker like Whitney? Just so I have a sense of what roles you might be playing with kids who are in school. Great, you can all see again? Jordan, will you give me a thumbs up? I can see your face. Okay, great, thanks. Okay, here are all the things that I'm hoping to cover. We have until 10 o'clock. Depending on how much you all wanna like jump in and have discussions, I might have to be more efficient with time. We'll just see, we'll play it by ear. So who here works with schools or works with children who are in school? Give me a sign. Or does anyone want to speak up? Okay, great. I know Whitney does. Yes, I see a thumbs up. Great. Do you, would y'all put, oh, in the chat, hang on. Zoom trainings are funny. Yay, school social worker, Jennifer King. Jennifer, will you put in the chat where you're working? I'm curious. And Jordan, I know you work with adults, but do you work with many adults who have kids in school? Yes. Yeah, great. Who's case manager? Oh, Burnsville. Ooh, that's a really interesting place to be a social worker. Let me know if you want to talk more about that, Jennifer. Great. Oh, Hannah, you're also CTSS worker. Great. I love CTSS workers. I'm assuming, Whitney, I know that you go into schools, and I'm assuming, Hannah, you also probably go into schools sometimes for CTSS work. Well, in any case, regardless of how explicitly we partner with schools as outside mental health providers, all of us are impacted or all of our clients are impacted by schools in some way. Either they came up through the schools and now they're adults, or they have children who are in school, or you are working with children who are in school. And in my experience, so I worked as a therapist at Clues, and now I'm, working in schools. So I've seen both sides of this. It's really uncommon that schools and outside mental health providers talk to each other and collaborate. And I actually think, and there are like very real reasons for that. Like we're all super busy and it's hard to get a hold of each other, and we need releases and we don't necessarily even know who the other person is. But I really want to put in a plug for how I think it benefits children if we are all talking to each other and sharing perspectives and being on a team together. And I'll talk a little bit more about why. Does anyone want, hang on, I think I have a slide on this. I do. So I'm curious, does anybody here work in early childhood? If you could just unmute yourself because I can't see all your faces. Anyone? Okay, then I won't talk about early childhood very much because that's a very different world than K-12 schools. Looks like there was a handful of elementary and I saw maybe a high school person. But just to say that education has, across the spectrum of education, everybody has things in common, but of course it differs by age level. And so elementary school kids tend to have a different experience in systems than middle schoolers or high schoolers. And those different systems tend to be, some of them are more stressed than others. For example, middle school programming in public education is even more stressed than the rest of public education right now. Does anybody want to throw out any particular schools that you interact with regularly? I saw Burnsville on there. I'm curious if there are places that, oh, I'm ignoring the chat and I should look at it. Actually, can you see the chat, Nancy?
Yes, I can see it.
Minneapolis Public Schools. Oh, yeah. Oh, Emerson. Yeah. Great. I'll ignore the chat if you tell me if stuff comes up. Great.
Adams.
Where's Adams? Is that St. Paul? Minneapolis?
Oh, St. Paul.
Okay. Okay. And Minneapolis and St. Paul Public are both huge public districts with very different ways, not very different, but different ways of operating. So that's just something for you to know. Okay. Oh, Mika's here. Okay, I'm letting in Mika. Which one did you say?
Hope.
Oh.
Hope Community Academy, Global Arts.
Great. Okay, super helpful. Hi, Mika, if you just came in. Nice to see you. And you can just put this in the chat at any point, but think about what are some of the things you find most confusing or frustrating when you collaborate or try to collaborate with schools that you want to better understand. And I will try to speak to those things. Oh, you know what I did, everybody? I didn't show you this screen that I was reading off of. I only did that in person. Well, here's the picture. Hey, this is another great book. Where'd it go? Do you know this one? Pilar's Worries. It's one of the only social emotional, like books about emotions that is written by a Latina author about a Latina kid that I recommend. There's a lot of really bad emotions books out there, but this one is great. Okay, so I really want to drive this home, which is that the school structure of the schools you're working with dramatically shapes who you're able to work with and what services kids have access to. And this is confusing to everyone, even people who work in schools. And so, and I know from experience, up here I have some schools that I've worked at, that in Spanish-speaking communities, there seems to be more of a prevalence of private and public charter schools that are specifically serving Spanish-speaking families. And so I think it's really important for you all as folks who are serving that community to know these differences, because it means that stuff that might be talked about in mainstream education doesn't quite fit in schools like Hiawatha Academy or Cristo Rey. So private schools like Cristo Rey, where I worked very briefly. Does anybody here work with Cristo Rey kids? You could, I actually can't see, but you could put it in the chat and Nancy will tell me. Private schools like Christ Rey or De La Salle, I'm trying to think of some other ones, Benilde St. Margaret, they're more likely to be religious, in particular Catholic, especially the schools that our client population might be going to. And it's important to know that private schools are not legally obligated to provide special education services to kids with disabilities or EL services to multilingual kids. And many private schools like Cristo Rey, I think Hope Academy is also private, if I'm remembering right. Yeah, okay, Nancy and Liv agree. Many of those schools will choose to contract with the public schools for special ed services and EL services. But it, you know, inevitably, even if they provide that, it's pretty watered down. Usually a kid gets like bused. When I was at Cristo Rey, I had a student with an IEP who would like bus a half hour away to another school for 2 hours and then come back. And that's generally not a super effective way to provide those services. And so when I was inside of Cristo Rey, it was really clear to me that there were a lot of kids who had disabilities or who needed EL services in order to really access school. And they weren't being identified because private schools don't have ways to do that. They weren't being identified unless they came in with something from a previous public school, and they probably weren't getting adequate services. So you could know that, like if you're working with a student who has ADHD and is really struggling in school, if they're at Hope Academy, they're probably not being adequately accommodated at a place like Hope Academy, and you might work with a family around understanding that. So what's that, Nancy?
Oh, Hannah mentioned that Hope Academy in Minneapolis is private, but Hope Community in St. Paul is charter.
Oh, thanks. Hope Academy in Minneapolis is private. Hope Community is charter. Yes, and these are really important distinctions, and it's super confusing. Then we have the whole like public sector, which are like traditional public schools are the largest presence in the public sector, and of course, like that's what has existed for many, many years. And that tends to be usually larger districts, so like Minneapolis Public Schools, Burnsville Public Schools, the independent school districts, I should have put those on here, like ISDs. Those typically draw from a regional area, and they're collectively funded by multiple large public districts, and they provide like specialized or higher level special education services. So like District 287, located in Richfield, serves students with IEPs from like all around that region, not just Richfield students. But I digress. So traditional public school districts are large. They have to follow federal and state public education laws, of which there are many. And maybe you heard this rumor, but schools are super, super stressed right now. And there's a part, you know, maybe the take-home message of this training is we could all like have some compassion for school districts because they're being asked to do an impossible amount of work with not enough resources. But that also doesn't mean that we should let them off the hook for serving students and meeting their needs. In particular, yes, Nancy.
Hannah has a question.
Yes.
She says, is ISD a distinction for schools nationally, or is that language specific to Minnesota?
That's a great question. You know what? I don't know the answer to that, but now I would love to find out. That's a really good question. You know, Minnesota is pretty famous for having more progressive education law and funding. Are you looking it up, Liv? Thanks. Okay, Liv's gonna try to find out the answer to that, Hannah. It wouldn't surprise me if that was a Minnesota thing, but I don't know the answer. So maybe we'll tell you in a second. Okay, and then public charters, where I'm located in one right now, are also public. So we're funded by the federal government. There's some real pros and cons to public charters, I can say from experience. Public charters are independent from larger districts, which means that they can specialize in certain pedagogies or really specialize in serving certain populations. So Great River, for example, is a Montessori school. It's very hard and maybe not possible to do real Montessori inside of a larger traditional public school system. And so public charters offer the structure to be able to do that. And we probably are all familiar with some of the public charters that specifically serve Spanish-speaking and Latino families, like Hiawatha Academy. When I was at Clues, I had lots of Hiawatha kids on my caseload for therapy, like Aurora Academy, Cesar Chavez in St. Paul. We probably could think of others if anybody wants to throw any in the chat. And so it's really important that we understand that these public charters have been created, or these charters that are like culturally specific have been created because in general, Spanish-speaking immigrant families are not being super well served in culturally affirming ways in the larger school districts. That's not always true, but it's a trend. And so these public charters serve a really important role as cultural spaces, and public charters make like, and there's larger political things to say about the larger role of charters that are, the introduction of public charters is in some ways part of an effort to undermine larger public school districts. So it's really complicated, and charters get less funding. We get like 85 cents to the dollar per pupil compared to traditional public schools. So charters to try to better serve certain populations, and they're doing it with a lot less resources, and that means their staff get paid a lot less, which means it's harder to hire people like special ed teachers or EL teachers and teachers in general. And lots of public charters are really struggling to pay the bills and keep the lights on. And there's been all sorts of stories in the news about that recently. And public charters still have to follow all the same federal and state education laws that larger traditional school districts do. And they often struggle to do that because they don't have the resources and they aren't part of these larger districts. So for example, Great River, where I am right now, is doing a really terrible job at adequately serving EL students. We're doing a great job with special ed, miraculously, given our funding, but we're struggling to do what we need to do to serve our special ed students. And many charters really struggle to do special ed, is a larger trend. Okay, moving on. Were there any other questions, Nancy?
I don't see any.
Okay, so you might know you're working with a student or a family and you want to reach out to the school to try to partner with them or get more information or get a copy of an IEP or something. And you might ask yourself, who should I be reaching out to? And the answer is, it depends on each school and each district, which is super confusing. So this is a long list, maybe I will read them all off, of possible adults who support a child in a school. Could be their teacher in middle or high school. It might be an advisor who's a teacher that is like point person for every student. Could be a school psychologist, a school social worker, a school counselor, an interventionist, a dean. Could be a special education teacher or case manager. So something to notice here is like there are all these titles that at different schools, they're different titles, but they mean the same thing. So like some schools call special education teachers teachers, and some schools call them case managers. They're the same thing. Could be an English language teacher. In some schools like Cristo Rey or Hiawatha, it could be a cultural liaison, or which also might be called a family liaison. Then there's like all these words for people who support special education, paraprofessional, education assistant, school educational assistant. They're all the same thing, and every school has a different word for them. Teaching assistants, in some schools, none of these helping positions exist except for probably special ed. And so the vice principal or the assistant principal is the point person for a lot of this stuff. And then occasionally we have school-based therapists. Is anybody here a school-based therapist? Your experience with schools would be very different from everybody else's if that's the case. But I know like some of you are CTSS workers who do school-based work sometimes. So this is a whole slew of people that you might reach out to, and it's hard to know who to reach out to. I'm going to highlight a couple here. These are the folks that are most likely to be someone who is the point person for supporting a child in a school. And in particular, cultural liaisons are more likely to be a parent point of contact. And if you were to coordinate with someone inside of a school, this is who you're most likely to talk to. Now, I, of course, have a little bit of a bias for school social workers, and I think school psychologists, school social workers, and school counselors are very different roles. I mean, in the end, they all potentially support the mental health and well-being of students, but we have different training and different roles in schools. And every school uses these roles differently. So, you know, I, as a school social worker, am very involved with all students. Well, I'm currently the SEL coordinator, but when I was working directly with students as a school social worker here, I was very involved with every student who in special education or in general education. I was talking to families, I was working with teachers, I was training staff on mental health. But in St. Paul Public Schools, the social workers only work with special education students. And so I have a good friend whose kids were in St. Paul Public, and she was an EL teacher in St. Paul Public. And she would call me all the time to consult on students that she was working with in her EL classroom. And she would tell me these stories about like kids that she was getting coats for, and kids that she was like helping their families figure out how to like pay their electric bills. And I would say, like, why isn't your social worker involved with these kids? Like the social worker should be doing that. You're the EL teacher. And then she would go to the social worker because I told her to. And the social workers would say, like, no, that's not our problem. We only work with special ed kids. So then she would go to the counselor, and the counselor would be like, oh, mate, like, schedule some time with me. Like, I'm really focusing on getting kids into college. And so there really wasn't a clear person who she could ask to support, and she was instead stepping in as this EL teacher. So this is all to say that ideally, if you need to coordinate with a school, there would be a school social worker that you could reach out to who would have the time to call you back and would know the student you're talking about, and you could team up. And that's not always the case. And so if you call a school and try to get a hold of the social worker and you hit a dead end, I would then try to get a hold of the school psychologist or a counselor, or try to figure out on their website or asking the family, who is the person that I can talk to? So here are some questions to ask yourself. Something's happening on my end here. There we go. If you need to contact a school, you could look at that list and say, at this particular school, who are the helper roles that I might work with? Who is supposed to be responsible for supporting my client? And then you might say, who is my client actually trust and talk to? Which could be like the front desk worker who is not responsible for supporting the mental health of your client, but might be the person who will talk to you and figure out how to get a hold of the person who's responsible for supporting your client. Yeah, and then the last question is like, who can you actually get a hold of? And unfortunately, who you can actually get a hold of is not necessarily the person who should be talking to you. But sometimes you gotta start where you can start. You know, and an example of this is, again, my friend who had her own children in St. Paul Public while she was an EL teacher. Her kids both are autistic and really struggled in traditional public schools. They come to Great River now and get adequately served, but in St. Paul Public, that wasn't happening. And she was trying to at least start by getting them a 504 plan. If you don't know what that is, I will talk about that in a little bit. And the social worker kept saying, I don't work with 504s. I'm special ed only. Another thing I'll say is that many schools only have like a 0.5 social worker or a 0.2. So even if someone wants to be working with you, they might be split between 4 different schools in order to be funded full time. So my friend, you know, asked around, and finally the vice principal told her that the school psychologist was the person responsible for 504 plans. And at Great River, the school psychologist only does special education evaluations, and we have an actual 504 coordinator, and the social worker supports that process. So this is all to say there isn't a clear formula for you to reference, unfortunately, and sometimes you have to do a little bit of sleuthing to find the person who will tell you how to get support for your client. Okay. When I was a therapist, I collaborated with a lot of school social workers. And as a school social worker, I've collaborated with a lot of therapists, and I have gleaned some tips for you around how to effectively talk to schools. And the first is to take schools and educators seriously, and the fact that they are also skilled professionals, and recognize that they are typically very stressed professionals in a very stressed system. And that maybe seems obvious, but I, over and over again, have had phone calls with therapists who treat me like I don't know what I'm talking about, who assume that I'm not actually a clinician because I work in a school. And then I'm like, let's go outside. But I mean, it was just like, and it really makes me angry, and it gets in the way of us being able to work to the best interest of children. When I'm spending all this time demonstrating my credibility and throwing my like LICSW around, like that's just not helpful. And which connects to the next point, which is try not to jump to conclusions before you've heard from the school's perspective. Now, there are plenty of school professionals in plenty of schools that are messing up with kids. Like that's real. And that's part of a symptom of a system that's just so stressed, and not set up to adequately support the well-being of kids, in particular with mental health challenges, and in particular BIPOC kids and immigrant kids. So I'm not necessarily making excuses for systems, but you can know like that's real, that it's just hard to do your job well within a school system. And before you take all those stories you heard from a student or a family and decide that like you got to fight the school, I would check in with someone at the school to try to get more information. So I actually just talked to a therapist right before school started, which connects to the bottom point here. Remember, school hours and school calendars are often different than yours, which means that school folks typically aren't available to talk to you over the summer unless it's one of those rare year-round schools. Or breaks, and schools often end at like 3:30 or 4, and so you might be trying to get a hold of somebody at 6 o'clock because you're still working, but you probably won't be able to reach a school professional. And then some folks, which is educators tend to not have great school life balance or boundaries with their jobs. So some folks will agree to talk to you anyways, and you could just know that that's like kind of a big deal. So I, right before school started, agreed to talk to this therapist and a student that I have worked with for many, many years. Her family is super complicated. They're also a bilingual family. And there's just a million layers in this family. And when this therapist reached out and said that she wanted me to join a session, oh, someone else is trying to log in. I'm gonna let them in. Great. When this therapist reached out to me, I was really excited because I have wanted this kid to be in therapy for many years. And so I agreed to talk to them over my summer break, even though technically I wouldn't need to be working over summer break. And that was like difficult to set up because I was at home. And I got into this session and the therapist just came at me and had made all these assumptions about how I hadn't been getting documents translated for the family, and I was enabling this kid being parentified. And it really caught me off guard because I had been like fighting for this family from within the school system for years. And she didn't pause to ask me like for information and context. She just assumed all these things about me. And then we had to spend all this time repairing that situation and her like kind of hanging her head after she figured out the reality. And this all happened in front of the student, which was like really unhelpful to the student. So this is to say, try to not jump to conclusions. It's okay to be skeptical for sure, and we all have good reason to be skeptical of educators, but to withhold your judgment until you have more information. Okay, another piece is that both of our environments as clinicians and as educators are super demanding, but in different ways. So as clinicians, especially for those of you that are therapists, you have back-to-back appointments. Maybe you have 5-10 minutes in between sessions. It's not like you have lots of time for phone calls with schools or trying to figure out who to talk to at a school. And it's a big deal. Usually it's not billable. It's a big deal when you choose to take some of your time to talk to someone at a school. That's something I think educators don't typically understand. And in education, they maybe are more flexible, but they also tend to have a higher volume of multitasking happening all the time. So if you get somebody on the phone from a school, they're probably simultaneously eating their lunch and maybe in a corner of a room with 10 other people, so they can't really have a private conversation. And they also maybe are checking their email while they're talking to you. And that's not because they're trying to be disrespectful, it's because like that's the reality of being in a school. We never, hardly ever get time to slow down and be by ourselves and really take a break, even if it's on your official break. And and so part of that is to say that as mental health providers, you get to schedule your time with clients and you see them during that scheduled time, and maybe you have some phone calls in those like 10-minute windows in between sessions where you're like listening to voicemail. When you're in a school, you're encountering students and families often in an unscheduled way. So this therapist who assumed I wasn't translating documents, part of that is because Great River is doing a really bad job of that. So that's a systems thing that I'm didn't say in this session that I'm advocating for behind the scenes. But the other part is that when that kid would walk into my office in crisis and say, I have my mom on the phone and I want to tell her what's happening, I'm not going to say, oh, hang on, let me put in a 24-hour request for an interpreter and we can schedule this meeting for tomorrow. I might actually do a follow-up meeting, but in that moment, there's not a possibility for me to call in a Chinese interpreter for this kid. And so we got to work with what we have and then follow up in a way that feels like we're catching all the pieces. So I think that that's generally pretty different than what happens in mental health spaces. Okay. Couple more things. Oops, your one didn't jump. There we go. Oh, this is what I was just saying. We're more likely to interact in unplanned ways and aren't always prepared to support. Like sometimes I'm eating my lunch and a kid like bursts into my office in tears, and then I just have to figure out how to deal with that. Another thing that I am sad to report, but it's true, is that educators are often suspicious of outsiders, and that's not fair to you, and it is the reality, and it's partly because everybody wants to beat up on schools, and educators are really accustomed to being criticized and not taken seriously and not respected. And in many schools, especially in the larger public districts, part of the way that staff survive that is to kind of harden themselves and not be super open to outside feedback. I have a lot of thoughts about how problematic that culture is and how maybe we could change that, but that's a big thing that needs to happen. In the meantime, you might call and someone might be like, why are you calling me? I don't have time to talk to you. And hopefully that's not the reaction you're getting, but you could just know that that's kind of a common cultural thing in schools and to try not to take it personally. I mean, I'm not saying it's okay, but it's not necessarily about you. Okay, and then lastly, educators tend not to understand what you do as mental health providers with kids unless they have gone to therapy themselves. And sometimes like a kid's teacher will inappropriately tell you all about their own experience in therapy because folks don't always have the same kind of boundaries that we do as mental health providers. And so you could just know that it's helpful to be able to explain what you're doing in ways that you don't have to do with other mental health colleagues. And I remember really distinctly my first year at Clues, I was working with a family. Actually, me and Whitney and Mika all shared this family. And the oldest child clearly had PTSD. And what that looked like was really like retreating into himself and shutting down and internalizing things. And I was in contact with the school social worker who was lovely and somehow was making time for me, even though she was half time. And she asked me to talk to his school team to try to help them understand how PTSD showed up for him, because they were not being very sympathetic to him. They were really taking it personally that he would like not look them in the eyes when he was upset. So I was on this phone call with this school team trying to talk about how he had PTSD, and they were not buying it. They were like, well, he doesn't like yell at me. They had like a stereotype of what PTSD was, and it wasn't lining up with what I was saying. And this was like my first year out of grad school. And I found myself getting really flustered and being really ineffective at communicating with them in a way that I was like, in case consultation, everyone understands me. And so I think that there's a certain skill set with talking to folks on the outside to be able to translate what you're doing for folks who don't have a clinical background is really a useful skill when you're advocating for students with schools, because you are in general going to encounter educators who care about kids but don't necessarily understand the ins and outs of mental health. Okay. Let's talk about special education, which we could do like a whole 2-hour training on in and of itself, and in particular disparities for Latino kids and immigrant kids in special education. And why don't you go ahead and throw questions in the chat if there's specific things you want me to address around special education. This was the slide that I like saved till the end last night because I was like, oh my God, there's so much to say. I don't even know where to start. So forgive me if this is too wordy, and ask questions. But special education is the system in public schools that provides specialized instruction and accommodations to students with disabilities. And what we define as a disability is really important. And sometimes it's things that people feel uncomfortable calling a disability, like ADHD. And I'm here to tell you that legally we have to call it that for kids to access accommodations, which can be a hard pill for parents to swallow and for therapists sometimes too. And often your role as outside providers is to help families reconcile for themselves their perception of what it means to have a disability or to label something a disability. The special education system is actually not that old in the United States, which we don't talk about very much. I mean, the IDEA Act was passed in 1990, and that's when IEPs started to be required in schools. I mean, I was in kindergarten. Jordan and I were in kindergarten together when that was passed. And man, it's an imperfect system. It's a super bureaucratic and clunky system. And there's lots I'd say about that in a separate 2-hour training, but just to know that it's super important. It's hard to navigate. Private schools are not required to follow it. It's just public, traditional public, and charters. Public schools, and also it costs a ton of money, and there's federal funding for it, but it's still super expensive. And so schools are kind of always in this push and pull of what's required of them in terms of serving students with disabilities and also figuring out how to pay for it. And staffing is often one of the more tricky things to pay for. Public schools have to follow what's supposed to be a data-driven process of interventions. There's like several rounds of interventions that you're supposed to do in the general education setting. General education is like where everyone is in school. Special ed is a separate setting within a school. So there's a series of interventions. You're supposed to collect data on them to document if they work or not. And if you go through a series of interventions and they don't adequately change a student's ability to access school, then the school might recommend a special education evaluation. It's also true that parents can potentially jump the line in that process by requesting a special education evaluation. That doesn't automatically mean they get it, but they do. The schools are required to respond to a parent request within 10 school days. So if today, what is it, Tuesday? On Tuesday, I went to Nancy, and Nancy was my kid's teacher, and I said verbally, it used to be you had to put it in writing, now it's just verbally. I said, Nancy, I think my kid should have an IEP. Then Nancy has to tell someone right away at school, teachers often don't do this, but they're supposed to, that this request was made, and the school has then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Monday, Tuesday, and if Yom Kippur is in there, then it's Wednesday, to formally respond to that family special education request. Hang on, my computer in person is, there we go. Okay, anybody have questions about that? I'll move past it unless you do. I will say parents find this unbelievably confusing, and that is a reasonable way to feel. And teachers find it super confusing too. So It's helpful if you have a general sense of that system so that you can help people make sense of their experience. These are the disability categories that I encounter most often for an IEP. And so we would say things like, oh, this kid has an ASD IEP or an SLD IEP. You'll hear educators talk about that. You don't have to know those acronyms. Educators are really bad at pausing to tell you what they mean. So you could tell parents, like, you can ask them what they're talking about. But physical health impairment, that could be someone who's in a wheelchair, or like I have a student with degenerative eye disease, so he's going blind, so he has a PHI IEP. OHD, I think this is important for you all to know as therapists. Other health disability is an OHD IEP, and that is what is commonly used to have an ADHD IEP, or you could have an OHD IEP for anxiety, which lots of folks don't know. It is questionable, I've tried to look into this legally, if you can have an OHD IEP for PTSD. And the message that I got was that PTSD is considered a temporary diagnosis, which we all might question that. But that's what people in special ed law think. And so you can't have an OHD IEP for PTSD. But if you as a therapist knew that maybe this kid needed a higher level of accommodation at school and only had a PTSD diagnosis, maybe you would add on an anxiety diagnosis, and that would allow them to then have an OHD IEP. Autism spectrum is also one of the more common ones that you might encounter. And then the very controversial EBD IEP, emotional and behavioral disorder. So in a perfect world, free of all our systems of oppression and biases, EBD would just be a category that served kids who had any kind of significant emotional or behavioral needs at school. And we do see that many of the kids with EBD IEPs actually have PTSD, or are Black and brown kids who are autistic and haven't gotten an ASD diagnosis. The reality is that EBD IEPs are super stigmatized, especially for kids of color. And lots of parents are concerned that if their child has an EBD IEP, that they'll get tracked, or that adults will make assumptions about them. And they'll end up in some kind of behavior room away from their peers. And that fear is not unfounded. I have seen that happen. And every school does it differently. Like there's a student here at Great River who throughout all of elementary was selectively mute. She was not disruptive. She just was not functioning very well emotionally and needed a ton of support. And she qualified for special ed under an EBD IEP. So, you know, ideally that would be how we use that category, but lots of schools, EBD is a really negative thing attached to a child's record. So like I have a family here that was thinking about changing with a Black child. They were thinking about moving their kid to St. Paul Public for various reasons. But we were trying to finish up the special ed qualification process before he left so that he could have accommodations when he got to his new school instead of the new school having to start over. And he clearly has ADHD, but this family is having trouble accessing a diagnosis for all the reasons that we see, right? Like health insurance issues, getting a neuropsych is super challenging for lots of folks. For some reason, this was the only time a pediatrician didn't want to like hand out an ADHD diagnosis, even though all other pediatricians seem fine with doing that. So he couldn't qualify as OHD. He immediately could qualify as EBD because of his impulsive disruptive behaviors at school. But this mom said, I don't want my kid to have an EBD IEP, so I'm refusing the IEP. Because she was like, that would be fine at your school, but if he goes to Como with an EBD IEP, like that'll be the end. He'll never graduate from high school. And that's real. So these are things to know if you're having students come in with IEPs like this. This is just context. Or if you're helping to advocate for someone being evaluated in a school. You can tell this is where my brain started. I was like, I have to talk about this, but I can't make a coherent slide. Some things I want to say that are really important about special education is that For those of you that can diagnose, so I know CTSS workers, that's not necessarily your job, but you can, team up with therapists to support that process. Having documentation from an outside mental health provider can be a game changer in terms of a special ed evaluation. So I have seen students who we all have a sense need support at school, but we haven't been able to adequately document the data in the intervention process. And so we're feeling stuck. And the minute we get a letter from a therapist that says, I have diagnosed this child with anxiety, we can move ahead with a special ed evaluation. In other schools, I should have said this, lots of large public districts are doing pretty intense gatekeeping around special education. It's super expensive and they get sued all the time around special ed stuff. And so it tends to be much harder, especially in the larger districts, for a kid to get through that process and be evaluated than it would be potentially at a smaller charter. If the smaller charter is adequately doing their special ed services, which is not always the case. So a trend that we're seeing actually is that a lot of families are leaving larger districts to go to these charters because they're trying to find a place that will give their child special education services. And that means that public charters have much higher rates of kids with IEPs than the traditional schools. And there's lots to say about that I won't say right now. So if a family is really wanting to demand an IEP and the school is giving them a hard time, this is what happened to my friend with her autistic kids in St. Paul Public. The school just wouldn't budge. And we're just like, well, we think your kid's just maybe kind of a bad kid, was the message she was getting. And oh my God, some terrible, terrible things were said to her and to her children. One of the ways they finally pushed for an evaluation for him, and this is like a white boy, imagine how hard this is for kids of color in these larger districts, is that she brought in an outside mental health evaluation with a very clear autism diagnosis. And so you play a super important role as outside providers when you give a diagnosis, and we all know diagnosis is complicated, but it can be the thing that allows a student inside of a public school to access greater accommodations. Oh, there's something else I was going to say, and I can't think of what it was. Well, I also say you play a really important role in helping families navigate their perception of stigma. A couple years ago, I was working with a family of a young Black girl who was just this like brilliant, super socially skilled kid. And she had used her social skills to mask her pretty significant learning disability for many years. She always was like working hard and being really helpful and hiding the fact that she couldn't read. And so this kind of slipped through the cracks over the course of many years, which shouldn't have, but it did. And on top of it, her family was really was worried about stigma. And so after a couple of years of this, I finally called them and said, like, let's talk about what you're worried about. What would happen if she was evaluated for special education and had a learning disability IEP? And her mom said, well, I don't know if I would call it a disability. And so then we talked about how like we have to call it a disability legally for her to access those supports. And so we had a long conversation about that. And at the end, she said, okay, I'm okay with you evaluating her. I'm worried about it, but I'm okay with it if you think that's going to get her what she needs. But does that mean she's just going to be put in a room with other kids with disabilities? And I imagine that mom experienced that in her school experience as a kid, right? And she probably saw other Black kids like her being like pushed off to these special ed rooms where those kids didn't get supports and didn't feel good about being at school. And that was not what was going to happen for her daughter, but it makes sense that that's what she was afraid of. So I think that's something that outside mental health providers can really help families work through, and also to accurately assess or try to accurately assess what the actual threat is. So that family I talked about that was going from Great River to St. Paul Public, potentially, they actually didn't leave, but that was the conversation we were having then. They had a real perception of threat. And so as therapists and skills workers, you can help families work through that. Other times, families, I think, really need help working through their stigma in order for their kids to access services. And there are lots of families who refuse special education services because they think it's going to protect their kid, but actually they're continuing to send their kid into a classroom without support in a way that makes it hard to learn and really interferes with their kid's ability to have meaningful peer relationships. And then, well, maybe I already spoke to this, just like the bias and discrimination in SPED is real. And in particular, for multilingual kids and EL kids, I anecdotally am seeing a pattern of schools deciding that a kid doesn't need to be evaluated because it's probably a language issue, even if the kid doesn't qualify for EL. So I'm seeing this across the board. And some schools are doing it well, and lots are not. That it's actually feeling harder for EL students and multilingual kids to access IEPs because schools are so jumpy about being accused of putting a kid in sorry, that's short for special education, putting a kid in SPED who actually just needed EL services. But the reality is there are plenty of multilingual kids who are multilingual and have a disability and deserve to have both kinds of services. And many public schools are not doing a good job of overlapping special education and EL, or even just like multilingual supports. So that's something that you can play an important role in advocating around and helping families understand what's happening for themselves, because they might hear from a school, sorry, we don't think it needs to be special ed. And you might say, well, I'm not sure about that. I actually want to look into it more. Okay. Checking the time. I should maybe talk faster, but remember to, if you have questions, jump into the chat. Briefly, I want to say about IEPs versus 504 plans. Are folks familiar with 504 plans? Can you like raise your hand if you are? Cool. I think even in the past 10 years, this has changed pretty dramatically. When I was in graduate school and was a social work intern at South High School, my mentor sat me down and was like, this is what a 504 plan is. Nobody knows they exist. And now Minneapolis Public has a full-time 504 coordinator, and Great River just created that position here this year too. So that's changing. IEPs are individualized education plans. An IEP is the formal plan that someone gets when they've entered special education. A 504 plan is a much simpler, much more flexible plan that doesn't require an evaluation process. Well, technically it does, but the evaluation process is like you have a conversation with the family and maybe get outside documentation of a diagnosis. That's it. An IEP, a special education evaluation process, takes like 2 months. There's tons of like hours and hours of testing and collateral information gathered. It's really intensive. A 504 plan could be like, we sit down and meet for a half hour and are like, yeah, great. I think this is appropriate. Let's write a 504 plan. Let's just do it right now. 504 plans tend to be like a page, and they are very simple accommodations that help a student access learning in the general education environment. So in special education, there needs to be specialized instruction. There's staffing attached to it. So each kid with an IEP has a special education teacher or case manager. There might be paras that are supporting that student. A 504 plan has no staffing attached to it, no funding attached to it. It's just something like, this child will be allowed to sit at the front of the room and take movement breaks and chew gum or have access to a fidget. It tends to be pretty basic. So 504s are easier to access. They also are less likely to be followed because no one's keeping track of them. And you can have a 504 for PTSD. You can also have 504s for like a peanut allergy or a concussion, or for things that might otherwise be an IEP. You could have a 504 for ADHD or autism. And sometimes a school will recommend a 504 first, and if the 504 is ineffective, then they'll recommend a special education evaluation. Public schools tend to not like 504 plans. I personally love them, but I am in the minority. And the reason for that is that they're not attached with funding, they're not attached with staffing. And schools often feel threatened when parents request them. That doesn't mean that they aren't legally obligated to provide them. if a school determines there's a need. So you as a therapist might help a family advocate for that. And your documentation can be the thing that can make a 504 possible in a school. Now, one thing I'll say though is I will frequently get documentation from a therapist. It's either like a copy of a diagnostic assessment, maybe it's a neuropsych, and in the recommendation section, it will say, the school should provide this child with a 504 or an IEP plan. And in schools, whenever we see that in documentation, we all like do a face palm, because that's not like a just like, oh, sure, we'll just give you one of those. Like there's a whole process. Not everybody with a diagnosis qualifies for either one of these things. And so it is appropriate for you to advocate for something like this in a school. But a surefire way to have someone slam the door in your face is if you come in and demand it without having a conversation first, because that's one of those things that people within schools are used to people from the outside jumping to conclusions about without pausing to ask questions. So if you're collaborative around this, it's more likely to be effective in supporting your clients. Okay. I'm gonna like give my eyes a break for a second. Maybe you want to too. And then let's talk about English language services, which for a long time was called ELL, English language learners. Now it's EL. When I was a kid, it was ESL, English as a second language. Now we know that lots of kids speak more than 2 languages. So anyways, EL is the current legal category. And lots of schools are not adequately doing EL. And I think that a lot of larger public districts are trying to figure out how to meet the legal requirement of providing EL while also chipping away at it. So there's a larger trend around EL really being under threat in ways that I feel like special education is more protected, which is maybe because special education families are more likely to be wealthy, resourced white families who make a lot of noise and sue schools if they don't follow special education law. And families who access EL services are less likely to feel empowered to do that. So it is appropriate to ask questions about what EL services a kid is getting at school. For example, in St. Paul Public, one of the ways that they're trying to problem solve this is having EL teachers co-teach a class, which basically turns the EL teacher into a classroom assistant. And that's how one of the ways they're dealing with their staffing challenges, but it's not really supportive of EL students. A thing that's happening here in Great River is that we don't have a physical space dedicated to EL services, and that is super problematic. We're like in the middle of a big fight about it right now. Anyways, public schools are required to screen students for English language services. They do it twice a year. Parents can refuse that screening, and they can refuse those services if they want to. But the school has to screen at least every fall any students that's been flagged as speaking 2 languages at home or a language other than English at home. And so if a family really doesn't want to have their kids screened anymore, they should just let them be screened one time, or this is like the most efficient thing. Let your kid be screened one time and then refuse services after that, if that's really what you want. Similar to special education, lots of families need support working through stigma around EL services. And families, rightfully so, sometimes feel worried that if their kid is accessing EL, it will mean that they're like rushed off to a separate room, that they are going to be separated from their peers, that they won't be taken seriously. I think that that generally does not happen anymore, but it still might, and it's worth keeping an eye on. Oh, good timing, Gloria. My coworker Gloria is walking in, the one with the extensive experience as an EL teacher. So throw your questions in the chat if you have EL questions. It's good that Gloria's here. Like I said, EL systems are chronically under-resourced and often not taken seriously. And we could talk about the role that racism and xenophobia plays in that. And private schools don't have to provide EL services. And they might like gratuitously throw something at a kid where they bus them somewhere else 1 hour a week, but usually that's not adequate. I will say when I was at Cristo Rey, wow, there were so many kids who really would have benefited with EL services, and instead someone just gave them a pep talk about trying harder. And that's really common practice in these culturally specific private schools. Okay, this is to Gloria's credit that I have this on here, because I just went and talked to her about it yesterday, and she gave me a document to look at. So I want to, this box on the right here is taken from this document, Dear Colleague Letter, English Learner Students and Limited English Proficient Parents, that was put out by Department of Education, right, Gloria? And it's worth reading. It's like 50 pages long. I'm gonna go like fully read it and then send it to all our program directors here later today, actually. But it's worth you knowing what those services are and what families are entitled to, because I think most schools are not, in particular following this piece about multilingual families. So public schools are legally obligated to provide all school information in a family's first language. That includes, and this is where I think a lot of families get missed, that is certainly true at Great River, that includes families where the student is English proficient and doesn't qualify for EL, but the parents are not English proficient and need everything translated. And I think many schools don't even really know that, even though they should. And even if they know it, they might not be doing it because it's a lot of work to have stuff translated, as every immigrant in America knows. And we just really want to take the burden off our children to have to be translating for their families. And we want parents to feel empowered to be a part of schools. Now, something you might support as a therapist or a CTSS worker is helping parents feel empowered to demand this. And I know from experience, lots of families feel embarrassed. They can see how much effort it requires to get stuff translated, and they want people to take them seriously. They're like, I mostly speak English. The family I was talking about earlier where the therapist came at me last month, that family, the parents are Mandarin speakers and mom speaks pretty good English. And for a while, I was sending her stuff translated. We still have a terrible system for that here, but I was trying really hard to get her things translated. And she finally said, you don't need to translate things for me anymore. It's fine. Like, I can understand this. And then recently what came out is that actually she wasn't understanding it. She just felt really bad that I was trying so hard to get it translated. So, you know, and like I was being really nice, and lots of school staff people are not nice about that process to multilingual families. And they might need you in their corner to help them advocate to have to meet their rights. Any questions about that before I move on? Oh, I did up here. Gloria, do you want to add anything? No. Okay. Were you going to say something, Nancy? Oh, okay. Oh, I'm messing my stuff up here. Okay. So I'm very briefly, I'm going to go through this kind of fast. Just talking about like what are things that make sense to advocate for as an outside mental health provider. I have a couple slides here on this. One is just to ask to collaborate. I think that when we share information with each other and when we connect as colleagues, that creates a support network, safety net that maybe didn't exist before. Last night I was like trying to brainstorm cases that I've worked on. There was a student I worked with at Cristo Rey who had the most epic trauma history, and he had never talked about it until he walked into my office as a school social worker. And it was really overwhelming. And he would like hallucinate in my office. Sometimes it was really scary. I felt super isolated in that. Cristo Rey was a hard place to work. I didn't stay there for a reason. And I worked really hard to get him connected with an outside therapist who then also felt very overwhelmed by the level of need that he was walking into her office with. And when she and I connected and started sharing information and collaborating, you know, of course, with his permission, with his parents' permission, the main function of that was that we felt more effective because we were working together. And I think that sometimes it just makes our jobs more sustainable to talk to other colleagues who serve different roles with a family. Of course, like that's easy for me to say. We all have a very limited amount of free time to do these things in, but it's appropriate to ask to just be in communication. with someone at the school and you as an outside provider. You might say, hey, in therapy, my client is reporting being bullied, or that there's this really unhealthy dynamic happening. I don't know if you're aware that's happening at school. What are you seeing? I really think someone should intervene on that. This particular picture is from a book called If You're a Kid Like Gavin. It's about a real trans kid who advocated for a bunch of changes in schools. And I specifically put this one in here because, you know, you might say as an outside therapist, in particular for a gender expansive kid, we all know this thing is happening, and I'm here as a therapist to say that it's really negatively impacting my client's mental health. And you can say that like assertively, throw around your credentials if you need to. Sometimes that makes a difference. I worked with a first grader once. She was not trans, but her younger sister had just died, and she was having all sorts of big disruptive behaviors in the classroom, and her teacher was reacting so horribly. We did end up firing him. And part of the reason we were able to do that is because we brought her therapist in and had the therapist document the impact his behavior was having on the student. Now, that's like kind of going nuclear, and I wouldn't start there, but sometimes it's important to do that. The other thing you could be to say, hey, my client is feeling really disconnected from peer relationships. Is there a friendship group somebody offers? Are there supports that someone can put into place to help this child build a sense of belonging at school? You might also be a person who helps brainstorm coping strategies. You know, if the school is like, we don't know what to do with this kid, they're like constantly throwing food at people during lunch, you might say like, well, that child actually has really high sensory needs around sound and food. Can we have noise canceling headphones during lunch? Is it possible for this child to eat in a quieter space during lunch? It doesn't mean that you might recommend something that actually can't work at a school, but it's useful for you to bring that up. And to collaborate with whoever you can get on the phone who can help you implement those things. You might also, like I said earlier, be a person who says, I think we should consider that this kid might need an IEP, or that this family might need a 504, and then we could think about an IEP. Like I said, please don't say, I demand an IEP for this child, because that's not very effective. But your voice matters, and your documentation matters in that process. And helping families understand if they want to ask for that is also important too. So I think another really important role you play for supporting students at school is helping families understand and process their experience of school. So you can help them understand what their rights are. You can help them make sense of confusing interactions with schools. You know, and that could be just like talking that through with them. I mean, I have kids, I know from experience, even with like pretty low level challenges, how distressing it can be to hear about something happening at school and not have the context, and that sometimes I need to call somebody up and talk that through. I work in a school. I have so many friends who work in schools. I can call Gloria and she knows exactly the teacher I'm talking about because we both work in the same school, and I still get stressed out. Imagine what that's like for families who maybe don't speak English very well, have very different experiences in schools themselves, and are maybe encountering really antagonizing or confusing interactions at a school. So it's helpful to have a place for parents to talk about that. It's also helpful for you to talk through stigma, in particular around disability, and making strategic choices around how you talk about disability. You know, we all know that folks of color are less likely to have disabilities identified and instead have that be criminalized. And that means that it's really important within schools and out in the world that folks of color get the disability accommodations they deserve to have. And sometimes we have to be strategic around how we advocate for that so that we're not contributing to someone being targeted. Just as I was talking about how EBD IEPs can be stigmatized, in particular for boys of color. We want to really be thoughtful about that and take families serious if they're worried about it and try to figure out how to get their kids' needs met. But pretending a disability doesn't exist in the long run never benefits anybody. And parents often need help understanding that. I think also I see all the time that parents, of course, project their own school experience onto their kids' school experience, and that can get in the way of their ability to understand what their child is actually experiencing at school and their child accessing services and working with school staff. In particular, well, this is maybe more of a Great River thing, but something I see a lot at Great River. We have a pretty anxious parent population here. Who have, sought out a specialized public charter because their kids were not being well served in larger districts. That's a trend for us here. I hear from parents all the time who experienced really awful bullying in their own school experiences, and they are very quick to assume that their child is being bullied here and jump to conclusions about like what a terrible human being that other kid is. And often what that parent needs is help processing what happened to them so that they can be more present for their child. And usually as a school social worker, that's not totally my job. And it's really helpful if a therapist wants to do that, if you have time to do that. Also, this picture is from a wonderful book that I hope you all know called Juliana's a Mermaid. Do you all know this book? I love it so much. Great. This is my last slide. So this is to say, oops. There we go. I'm in both spots. Your involvement in schools, on school teams, is really important, and it really makes a difference if we're all teaming together to support a student. There are things that you know about a child or work that you can do with a child that can't happen in a school. And that's a piece of the puzzle that when that's brought forward, it creates a more whole picture of who a child is and who their family is, and can help create more compassion by school staff and help us understand what really needs to happen to get that child support. Just as I said earlier, that educators often encounter that outside mental health providers don't take them seriously. It's also true that you have skills that they don't have, or you have the ability to do work with students and families that we can't do. I often, having done both things, I often encounter family situations as a school social worker where I'm like, I really wish I could go into therapist mode right now, but that's not my job here. And I'd really like this family to go see a therapist and do that work. So the more we collaborate with each other and talk to each other, the better served students are. And also, I think the more we know each other as colleagues, like makes our work more sustainable when we're connected to each other. And we can each bring different perspectives to what's happening for our child. And if we do that in a way that's not competitive with each other, that's collaborative, it really supports our well-being as adults who are existing in really strained systems, advocating for a client population that is really under attack in our country. And so the more we can support each other, the better work we can do.
Yay.
Thanks, everybody. Muchas gracias. Nancy's coming up.
And I didn't see any questions, but if you have, sorry, I'm out of the screen. Any other questions for Saleha before we end today? Feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hands. I'm gonna stop sharing.
I just wanted to say thank you to Saleha because this was super helpful. Like this perspective was, yeah, it was just really refreshing to hear your experiences and super helpful and super applicable to all the work we do. So thank you for sharing.
Thanks, Whitney.
Is Saleha able to share her contact information?
Yeah, I would love to. Let's see. Should I put it in the chat? How do you want to do that?
Yeah, let's put it on the chat. Or, yeah.
Ooh, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to give you my new private practice email. Oh, that's Tamika. so that I start using it. Let's see. Cattail therapy. Or I'll just give you my personal email too. I'm getting this private practice started up, so I'm trying to use that email, but I don't check it super frequently yet.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Saleha. I feel like this information and just hearing from you and being an advocate for students in our schools is just so refreshing to hear. So I appreciate all the work that you do.
Thank you.
And
Thanks, Jordan, for asking me to do it.
thank you. Great. And then also just on the chat, a little shout out for our next meeting will be in October 20th, 2023, so this year, 12 to 1:30 p.m. So we are changing time. So it'll be during the lunch hour. It'll be on eating disorders in our Latina communities. And the presenter will be Ashley. So thanks all for joining us today. I hope you all have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.